He drove tanks into Normandy. He won the most grueling endurance races on the planet. He built the car that embarrassed Ferrari in their own backyard. And then, 2 months after the greatest injustice of his career, he died alone, on a California racetrack in a car that had already killed someone else, testing it for the company that had just stolen his victory. Ford versus Ferrari gave Ken Miles his due. Christian Bale's performance is extraordinary, and without that film, most people outside hardcore racing circles would never have heard his name. But the film still left enormous parts of his story on the cutting room floor. The real Ken Miles was more complex, more tragic, and in some ways more extraordinary than the version Hollywood put on screen. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the man described as the best test driver Carroll Shelby ever knew deserved a far better ending than the one history gave him. Ford vs. Ferrari introduces Ken Miles as a hot-headed mechanic with a struggling shop and a talent too big for anyone but Carroll Shelby to recognize. It's a great character setup, and it's only partially true. The film gets Miles's origins right in broad strokes. Born in Sutton Coldfield near Birmingham, left school at 15, apprenticed at Wolseley Motors. But what it skips over is the depth of the man before he ever climbed into a GT40. Miles's first military role was as a driving instructor in the Territorial Army. On October 1, 1942, he became one of the founding members of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the REME, an elite corps responsible for keeping Britain's armored vehicles in fighting condition. He was subsequently posted to the Guards Armored Division, then the 29th Armored Brigade. He landed in Normandy on June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, and ended the war as a staff sergeant and tank commander. Think about what that actually means. This wasn't some guy who drove trucks in the rear echelon. Miles commanded tanks through the worst fighting in Western Europe, responsible not just for driving, but for the mechanical integrity of machines that were the difference between victory and catastrophic death. His job was to understand every component, every failure point, every stress threshold, and to make split-second decisions when things went wrong at speed. That experience didn't just give Miles a love for machinery, it gave him the engineer's instinct that would later make him irreplaceable. When Miles told Ford their GT40 was dangerous, he wasn't guessing. He was a man who had spent years keeping armored vehicles together under conditions that would destroy lesser machines and lesser men. The film shows none of this depth. It gives us the eccentricity, the Brummie accent, the flying wrenches. What it misses is the bedrock seriousness underneath the personality. Here's the thing about Christian Bale's Ken Miles. It's a brilliant performance of a character that doesn't quite match the historical record. The film portrays Miles as an explosive, confrontational outsider, constantly fighting Ford's corporate machine, threatening officials with wrenches, punching Carroll Shelby in the face for fun. It's entertaining cinema. But people who actually knew Ken Miles tell a different story. Miles had a reputation for courtesy on the track and was sometimes called the Sterling Moss of the West Coast. He was regarded as a clean, fair competitor who had an exceptional feel for a car's limits, a quality that prevented him from making contact with other drivers even in the most aggressive racing situations. Carroll Shelby himself, in a biography of Miles published in 2004, described him in terms that don't match the Hollywood version at all. Shelby called Miles the best test driver he ever knew and said he was helpful to other drivers. He reminded me of Fangio in that regard. He would take time to teach the other drivers. Miles described himself this way: "I am a mechanic. That has been the direction of my entire vocational life. Driving is a hobby, a relaxation for me, like golfing is to others." A man who described driving as his hobby, like golfing. That's not the combustible, glory-hungry racer the film depicts. The real Ken Miles was a deeply intelligent, sardonic, self-aware professional who happened to also be one of the fastest drivers on the planet. The film exaggerated his hot temper to create dramatic tension with Shelby, understandable from a storytelling perspective, but it strips away something important about who Miles actually was. A man whose emotional discipline was as extraordinary as his mechanical genius. Ford versus Ferrari shows Miles winning Daytona and Sebring in 1966 before Le Mans, but it doesn't fully communicate what was actually at stake. No driver has ever won the 24 hours of Daytona, the 12 hours of Sebring, and the 24 hours of Le Mans in the same year, Ken Miles lost the chance to become the first driver to do so when Ford team orders for a photo finish cost him the 1966 Le Mans. As of today, in 2026, that feat still has never been achieved. Not by Andretti, not by Alonso, not by any driver in the 60 years since Ken Miles came within a few hundred meters of doing it. The Triple Crown of endurance racing in a single year remains the most elusive achievement in motorsport history. And Miles was the only man ever to have all three within his grasp simultaneously. Charlie Agapiu, a Shelby mechanic who was there, put it bluntly, Ford didn't want Ken to win at Le Mans. They wanted the headlines to read Ford wins Le Mans, not Miles becomes the first to sweep Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans. The film captures the photo finish controversy well, but it doesn't land the full weight of what was being stolen. This wasn't just a race win. It was an unrepeatable moment in sporting history. A record that would have stood forever and that still stands unclaimed today, like a trophy left on an empty shelf. Ford versus Ferrari shows Carroll Shelby delivering the photo finish order to Miles with obvious reluctance, and Miles accepting it with philosophical grace. That's broadly accurate in spirit, but the moment was rawer than the film suggests. Shelby mechanic John Collins recalled, "After Carroll talked to Ken during the final pit stop, I heard Ken say, in a loud voice, 'So ends my contribution to this bloody motor race,' and he threw his sunglasses across the pit." That's the real Ken Miles. Not stoic, not philosophical, furious, but containing the fury in the only way a professional could, by committing to the order, even while making absolutely clear what it was costing him. Carroll Smith, the Shelby team manager, said he leaned over and told Miles, "I don't know what they told you, but you won't be fired for winning Le Mans." Miles never talked about it afterward. They were the best of friends, and he never discussed it. And then, years later, Carroll Shelby said something that makes the whole thing even more devastating. In 1966, Ford didn't cost Ken Miles the race at Le Mans. I did, and I regret it to this day. Leo Beebe came up to me and said, "Who do you think should win the race?" I thought, well, hell, Ken's been leading for all these hours. He should win the race. I looked at Leo Beebe and said, "What do you think ought to happen, Leo?" He said, "I'd kind of like to see all three of them cross the finish line together." So I said, "Let's do it that way then," not knowing that the French would interpret the rules the way that they did. There's the real villain of this story. Not Leo Beebe, not Henry Ford II. A single casual conversation between two men who both thought they were doing the right thing, and the most extraordinary driver of his generation paid the price for it. 2 months after Le Mans, August 17, 1966, Riverside International Raceway, California. The film shows Miles dying in a fire. The real circumstances were different, and in some ways worse. The Ford J car was intended to be the successor to the GT40 Mark II. It featured a bread van-shaped rear section experimenting with camback aerodynamic theories, and a honeycomb panel design supposed to both lighten and stiffen the car. But the design was unproven with high-speed prototype sports cars. Here is what Ford versus Ferrari doesn't tell you. The J car had already killed someone before Miles ever got in it. Walt Hansgen, a 4-time SCCA road racing champion, a Formula One points scorer, and one of the most respected drivers in America, was killed while testing a Ford GT40 at the Le Mans test weekend in April 1966. His car aquaplaned in the rain. He tried to steer into an escape road and found a barrier that hadn't been there before. He never regained consciousness. He died 4 days later. After Hansgen's death, Ford decided to shelve the J car and focus on the proven MK2s. The program was halted. The dangerous prototype sat in a garage while engineers tried to understand what had gone wrong. And then, 4 months later, they resumed testing, with Ken Miles at the wheel. A series of trouble-free laps had been made before the accident. On the final lap, there was nothing to indicate anything wrong as the car came down the backstretch at about 175 miles per hour. Then, toward the end of the straight, when the car had slowed to approximately 100 miles per hour, it went out of control, spun to the inside of the course, and went over a tall embankment. The car bounded end over end. Ken was thrown out of the car and was dead of head injuries before emergency crews reached the scene. The main section of the chassis caught fire after coming to rest, and the fire damage, plus the physical battering given the scattered components, made it doubtful that the reason for the accident would ever be determined. His son, Peter, 15 years old, was at Riverside that day with his mother. He watched his father die. The exact cause of Miles's crash was never officially determined. The fire that consumed the car's remains destroyed most of the evidence. But in the decades since, the physics have become clearer. After the crash, the aerodynamics of the J car were greatly modified to correct the rear-end lift generated at race speeds. Years later, Porsche and others had the same problem. The long, low silhouette of a camback-tailed car behaves like an aerofoil aircraft wing and lifts at high speed. Think about what that means. The J car's distinctive breadloaf rear end, the very feature Ford's engineers were excited about, the aerodynamic innovation they thought would make it faster, was, at certain speeds, generating lift underneath the rear of the car, like a wing, like an airplane trying to take off. At over 200 miles per hour on a downhill straight, in hot California desert air, the rear of that car was fighting against the road, and at some point, it won. Carroll Shelby said, "We really don't know what caused it. The car just disintegrated. We have nobody to take his place. Nobody. He was our baseline, our guiding point. He was the backbone of our program. There will never be another Ken Miles." Road and Track's James T. Crow, writing in November 1966, put it plainly, "No one who knew Ken's driving can believe that the accident resulted from a mistake on his part. Ken Miles didn't crash that car. The car failed him." Here is the detail that makes this story truly extraordinary, and that Ford versus Ferrari completely omits. Ford executives, under pressure after the second fatal accident in the program in 5 months, ordered a roll cage similar to those used in NASCAR Grand National Competition to be installed in future versions of the car. The significantly revised J car was renamed the Ford Mark IV, and that roll cage, mandated by Miles's death, almost certainly saved Mario Andretti's life at Le Mans in 1967, when Andretti had a massive accident and walked away. Steel roll cages became standardized following Miles's accident. This safety improvement has saved countless lives since, including the life of Mario Andretti, who crashed at Le Mans during the 1967 race. Ken Miles died because a car was built with insufficient aerodynamic testing at race speeds, and because he died, the cars that followed were built safer. The roll cage that protected Andretti at Le Mans in 1967 exists because of Ken Miles. The Mark IV that won Le Mans in 1967, the car that completed Ford's dynasty, was built on the lessons of Miles's death. He made it possible from beyond the grave. The film shows Shelby and Miles as combative partners who love each other in the way that only two people who've thrown things at each other can. That's true. But it misses the depth of what Shelby actually felt. After Miles's death, Shelby American withdrew from Le Mans racing, not temporarily, permanently. The team that had just won the most famous endurance race in the world, that had built the car, developed the driver, and put Ford on top, never returned. Shelby said that losing Ken broke his heart, and Shelby American withdrew from Le Mans racing after 1967. For a man who defined himself by competition, by winning, by going back for more, that withdrawal speaks volumes. Shelby had raced through failure, through near bankruptcy, through corporate interference from some of the most powerful executives in American industry. He came back from everything, but he didn't come back from losing Ken Miles. The film ends with Shelby visiting Peter Miles and handing him a wrench, a scene that didn't happen in real life, but that captures something emotionally true. What it can't capture is the years of guilt that followed. Shelby spent the rest of his life, he died in 2012 at 89, carrying the knowledge that a single casual conversation at Le Mans had denied his closest friend both the greatest victory of his career and 2 months later, whatever future came after it. Miles was posthumously inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2001, 35 years after his death. 35 years. For 3.5 decades, the man who Carroll Shelby called the backbone of Ford's entire Le Mans program, the man who won Daytona, won Sebring, and effectively won Le Mans, was remembered only by the people who had been there. It took a Hollywood film in 2019 to make his name a household word, and the film still softened his story. It still gave him a calmer death than the one he got. It still condensed and simplified a life that was richer and more complicated and more human than 2.5 hours could ever contain. Molly Miles, his widow, wrote to Road and Track in November 1966, "Nothing could ever replace what I have lost. But the love and kindness showered upon me has been unbelievable. It has been a great life out here in California. Sometimes controversial, sometimes turbulent, but we have been happy. Sometimes controversial, sometimes turbulent, but happy. That's not the portrait of a driven, tortured, racing obsessive. That's a man who had built a life he loved, with people he loved, doing work that genuinely fulfilled him. And it was taken from him by a car that shouldn't have been running that day, on a track where the evidence burned before anyone could find the truth. Here is the thing that haunts this story more than anything else. Had Ford not orchestrated the photo finish? Had Miles been allowed to take the Le Mans victory he earned? Had he spent those final 2 months as the first man in history to win the Endurance Triple Crown in a single year? Would he still have gotten into that J car? There's no way to know. But it's worth sitting with the question. Miles died as a test driver, doing the thankless, dangerous, poorly credited work that he had always done, the work that made the GT40 great, that made the Cobra great, that made every car he touched better than it was before he arrived. He died not in a race, not in front of a crowd, not with any of the context that would have made his death legible as a racing driver's death. He died on a Tuesday afternoon, testing a prototype in the California desert, doing a job that needed doing for a company that had just denied him his crowning achievement. Ken Miles didn't die a hero's death. He died a working man's death. And that, more than anything else, is what Ford versus Ferrari couldn't show you. Carroll Shelby's quote about Ken Miles is the one that matters. We have nobody to take his place. Nobody. He was our baseline, our guiding point. He was the backbone of our program. There will never be another Ken Miles. He was right on every count. Ford won Le Mans in 1967, 1968, and 1969. But they never built another Ken Miles. No one did. The combination of engineering intelligence, driving sensitivity, and quiet professionalism he brought to the program was singular, a product of a specific life, a specific war, a specific set of experiences that no one else had and that no one could replicate. He left behind his wife Molly, his son Peter, who watched him die at 15 and who has not been back to Le Mans since. A car he helped build that won 4 straight races. A record, the Triple Crown in a single year, that no one has managed to equal in 60 years of trying. And a name that, thanks to one film and one extraordinary performance by Christian Bale, finally means something to the world. It took too long, but here we are. If you want the real stories behind the films Hollywood simplified, this is the channel for you. I dig into the history left on the cutting room floor every week, because the truth is always more interesting than the version that made it to the screen. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.